computer. There we go, recording has started. So welcome to tonight's talk for the Sooke Fine Arts Show 2021. We will be talking with Bob Leatherbarrow, and his topic today is what's it all about? I'll talk about that in a little bit more in depth in a moment, but I would like to note that about Bob, that he lives, like I said, in the wilds of Salt Spring Island. So there could be the odd time that he is he pops out of things. We have backup standby, ready to go, phone lines and all the rest of it. So don't fear if he disappears for a few minutes. We'll get him back online as soon as we can. Now I'm just in the process of muting and turning off screens wherever I can so that we can save as much of the video bandwidth as we can for Bob to be talking. So just one moment here, please. And Debbie, I'm going to turn yours off as well. Sorry. Stop video. And then the last, Ray, I'm going to turn yours off for a minute or two too, or while we're going along here. So I think that's everybody off of there. Switch into the speaker view. And should be talking. Do I have Gertie? I have Gertie up there on the screen right now, but you should be seeing me on the screen talking. If that's working, then we're technologically sound here and away we go. So I will say that Bob is from Salt Spring Island, as many of you know. He's been creating kiln-formed glass for over 30 years, and he's widely known for his signature style of organic textures made using glass powders. Through these textures and blending of colors, Bob explores and enhances the origins and interpretations of subtle fabrics common to nature and our daily observations. Every year, Bob dedicates 2 months to new ideas and approaches to working with glass. One piece in the Sooke Fine Arts Show 2021 represents a new series that focuses on patterns of detailed geometric shapes. His glasswork has been exhibited and collected in Canada and internationally, and has been widely recognized in books and magazines. Bob's background in science and exploration, gained from a career in geology, has been applied to his understanding of how glass behaves when heated in the kiln. This approach has led to his developing and championing innovative techniques for the relatively new kiln-formed glass discipline. This knowledge and approach has been shared across the kiln-formed glass community through international teaching, ebooks, videos, and ongoing articles in major glass magazines. So today, Bob's going to be talking to us about the really common question that is, what's it all about? He's going to address the age-old question by describing his background, his influences, and his artwork. So he's asked that we join him as he reveals his transformation from corporate culture to creative passion. So Bob, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Terry. And I'm going to turn my video off. And Terry, you're going to share the screen, right?
I am going to do that right now, you bet. And here we go. Let's just see how this all works. So you should be able to see the screen.
Yeah, I can certainly see it. And okay. Welcome everybody. And if people are interested, I know there's several glass artists in the audience tonight. So if you have technical questions, I'm more than willing to answer them and discuss them with you. So feel free, and don't worry about interrupting. I like to get questions as they come to your mind. So feel free. And as an artist, I always realize that, you know, when you're at an opening, somebody's going to come up to you and say, what's it all about? And this is an age-old question that has bothered or challenged me. And there's a number of answers. One of them simply could be, it's about $500. And I don't mind that as an answer, because we're all trying to make a living as artists. But also, you know, the work is about what your background is or what your personal philosophy is. So I'm going to walk you through several of the things about what my work is all about. And I've been working in kiln-formed glass for quite a long time, but my background was as an exploration geologist. And in exploration geology, you look at textures, and these maps and cross sections are of the Hibernian field and shows a whole bunch of faults and fault patterns. And by looking at them, you can interpret the history of an area. And so my whole background was about looking at textures and looking at patterns and trying to understand how you could build a story out of them. And I didn't realize it, but that all got translated into my glass. Next slide, please, Terry.
Oh, trying to. There we go.
So in the upper left-hand corner is a salt flat from a lake bed that's dried out. And I really love that polygonal pattern. And the small shield on the right is sort of my interpretation of that translated into glass powders. So a lot of my work has very subtle geological references in them. Next slide, please. And these two slabs of rock or slabs of glass are actually rock faces. And they're about 18, 20 inches high. And they're really based on different kinds of erosions that you see on a cliff face. So the one on the left has eroded by chemical erosion, and you sort of see these bands of color in rock, whereas the one on the right has all these hard, sharp lines, which was all faults and joint patterns. So quite often you'll see these subtle things in my piece, but I use a lot of color to try to bring out to emphasize these patterns. Next slide, please. And some of them are pretty obvious. This piece here is a piece that I did at Pilchuck during a class there. And it's based on a landform. And I worked, there's a small map down on the lower right-hand side, and that's the topography of an area of offshore Newfoundland called the Orphan Basin. And I just like the shape of the basin, and I spent 3 years working on it. And so I use that as a model for this piece in the upper left-hand corner. And what I really liked about it was the processes that I used to make that glass slab were the same ones that occurred in nature. I used a very powerful sandblaster to actually erode away parts of the glass that would reflect the topography. And this is just thin bands of powder between sheets of glass. And so you get these really neat color patterns. And as I said, it's a very direct reference to geology. Next slide, please. And some of them are more subtle. And I've done a number of pieces that have small bowls or artifacts that have been washed up on the shore. And when you look at this, you see sand waves, and you think, well, they're pretty sand waves. But if you actually were a geologist and looking at this, you see that the sand waves, there's two different orientations to them. And so the sand waves on the left-hand side are building towards the right, and on the right-hand side, they're building towards the left. And so a geologist would look at this and say, oh, that's a tidal flat. So I hide these little geological features in there, and I put a shell or something in to augment that. But I always do these in the hopes that somebody will come along and say, oh, tidal flat. Next slide, please. And so I'm always looking at textures. And if you remember a long time ago, there's a movie with Bruce Willis called The Sixth Sense. And a little child says, I see dead bodies. Well, I see texture. And so the automobile or Jeep that's in the top corner was in our back alleyway for a couple of years, and it was owned by a neighbor. And he was always apologizing for the mess being there. But I looked at it and I saw the red undercoat paint and the blue main paint job that was all cracked and eroded, and the fenders had these funny rust colors in the firewall. And so one day when he was apologizing, I said, well, I went and got this bowl, and I brought it out and I said, Rob, this bowl was actually based on your Land Rover that you're rebuilding. And he was very surprised. And I said, but it's been there for 2 years. Perhaps it is time for you to fix it or move it on. So I'm always looking for textures. And what I really want to do in nature, the textures are very subtle. But what I do is I use color to amplify them. And I really like working with textures because they tell you the story of what's happened. And it could be anything from rocks through to looking at the hands of an elderly person, and all the cracks in their hands really tell the story of what their life was like. So for me, textures are very important. Next slide, please. And for me, it's about temperament. And as a geologist, I spent 8 summers working in remote parts of Canada. And that really taught me to be perseverant. And, you couldn't get in the car and get out of a rainstorm. If it was miserable, you just worked. And so this really affected my personality. And I have it's a grittiness. I will work away at something until I finally solve it. And I'm very, very persistent. So I think a lot of that does come from my experience in the field. And this tent at the bottom was in the Selkirk Mountains, and another guy who's as tall as I am, and I'm 6'5". We were stuck in that tent for 5 days straight, waiting for the snow to melt. And if you want to talk about cabin fever, that's cabin fever. Next slide, please. And it's about influences. And the piece on the left is a piece by the American glass artist William Morris. And his work has really influenced me. He does a number of things. He works with textures. He works with imagery, and a lot of it is prehistoric cave art. And he also works with components. And so I really got into thinking about how he works, and it really, really affected me. So even something as subtle as the components, he doesn't make that piece to look like that. He actually just makes things like spearheads and arrows and gourds and all sorts of things. And then when somebody says, we'd like you to put on a show, he goes into his barn, which I've been in, and he puts together components to make up the pieces that go on the show. And I thought that was a really spontaneous way of working with it. And I really, really enjoyed it. So the small shields on the upper right are my version of working with components. And I make all these separate features, like the one at the bottom of the horse. They're done with powder. And if I like them, then I can carry them into the work. If I don't like them, it's just a few tablespoons of powder, and I don't mind throwing it out. So this whole idea of components is really, really important to me. Next slide, please. And so much of my work is based on working with glass powder. And I really, when I started working with glass powder, it just changed my whole perspective on working in glass. And most of us come from a stained glass background, or we're used to working with sheet glass. And if you have a sheet of a certain color, by God, it's that color. And yet when you're working with powder, you can start blending the colors together, and it becomes much more painterly. And so this nested pair of bowls, the outer more orange bowl, there's probably 6 or 7 different colors of powder in there that I've blended together to get that very painterly effect. And I really like working with it. The challenge is you can't reproduce them very easily, but that's the beauty of the spontaneity of working with powder. Next slide, please. And I use powder in a lot of subtle ways, and the pages in these books are actually done with sheets of clear glass and very, very thin layers of powder in between. And when I started making these books, I wanted light to transmit through the package of pages. And these books are life size, so these pages are an inch to an inch and a half thick. And so I wanted the light to transmit through. And if I used even the softest tinted glass, they were so dense that with that thickness of glass, none of the light got through. So what I started doing was taking sheets of glass and putting very, very thin layers of transparent powder in between and building up a stack of glass and then firing in that. And now the light can come in and come along the clear bands and sort of reflect back and forth and pick up whatever the color of the transparent powder is. So it adds the color that I want, and also it solves the technical problem of bubble control. The powder allows air to escape. So I made a lot of these books, and they're really, I call them my light reading series because the light is moving through them. Next slide, please. And my background in geology required me to understand science, but the neat thing about geology, it's an inexact science. So you don't have to, it's not as rigorous as physics or mathematics. It is just kind of looking at observations. So one of the things that I got quite involved with was working with powders was working with surface tension. And glass wants to be 1/4 of an inch thick, but if it's less than that, it starts to contract. So I figured out how to do that, and I could build this crackled texture here, and that's sort of one of my signature styles. And I did that for a long time, and the powders in combination with the science allowed me to understand how this occurred. Next slide, please. And the other thing that I really like working with glass is chemical reactions. You get, I call it getting 3 colors for the price of 2. And when you look at this piece before it's fired in the kiln, it's all an off-white creamy color. But there's, in the background glass, there's lead, and in the small dots, there's sulfur. And when you heat this up and they melt together, the lead and the sulfur combine to make lead sulfide, which is that nice black rim. And so it really brings out the shape of the piece. And you can see on the inside of the bowl, the entire inside of each dot is gray because of that chemical reaction. Next slide, please. But once you understand how things work, you can kind of cheat to get them to do what you want them to do. And I was making this large bowl. You'll see it in full view in a moment. And it's done on an opaque white glass. It's very, very stark white. But I wanted to have all those patterns highlighted and make them stand out a bit. And if you look very closely, there's a fine black line around each one of them. And so that's the chemical reaction to do that. But those colors don't react with the white glass. What I did was I put a thin layer of a color called French vanilla that does react with those colors. Put that on first, fired that onto the sheet glass, and then put my pattern on top. Got the chemical reaction that I wanted, and then I sandblasted off and removed the rest of the French vanilla. So all you see is the opaque white. So you know, it's a bit laborious, but I get what I want with it. So it's you know, an interesting way of working with chemical reactions. Next slide, please. And most glass is supposed to be 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch thick when it's fired to full fuse. But I like the delicacy of glass. It's supposed to be light and delicate looking. And so I found a way of firing on a single sheet of glass to full fuse and only using 3 millimeters as opposed to 6 millimeters. So this piece here, the white lines are fired onto one side, and then I turn it over and make the white lines fired onto the second side. And the the dark glass is just 3 millimeters thick. And when it slumps, this is a piece that's about 9 inches in diameter and 8 inches deep. And when it slumps into that deep shape, it really gives that nice delicate look. Next slide, please. And as I said, it's all about components. I really like working with them. And that lesson that I learned, influence I got from William Morris, set me off on an interesting path. And so what I would use is stencils and patterns to sift a little bit of powder onto a kiln shelf, and this little stick man at the top are some of those very fine patterns. And then I could fire those into another piece and either tack fuse or full fuse them on. And what I really like about this is that it leads to a lot of spontaneity. I make up a lot of I call them wafers. I make up a lot of wafers, and then I get to choose the ones I want. And it also allows me to be to push my limits, because you're only working with a few tablespoons of powder. And so if it doesn't work, you haven't wasted a lot of time and materials and electricity. You can just say, well, that didn't work, but it's always allowing you to push forward and try new ideas. So I really like working with components. And the bowl on the bottom has been fired 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And so as opposed to doing it all in 1 or 2 firing, I break it down into a lot of different firings. And the small piece on the left just shows some stencil patterns that I got, and they're from I believe from either Chinese or Japanese symbols. And what I do is I disaggregate them and make them into my own patterns that have really no meaning, other than I just like the shapes and the patterns that they make. Next slide, please. And so here's some more components. And this the piece on the right, it's over about 1 meter tall, and it's 1 inch thick, and about 6 inches, 7 inches wide. And it's shaped like an airfoil. I'm going to talk a bit more about it later. But what I did was I took a lot of these small pieces of white, French vanilla, marzipan, driftwood gray, a whole bunch of very, very soft colors. And I fired them, broke them up into sheets, into pieces, put them on a piece of fiber paper, and then put a clear sheet of glass on top and fired that to full fuse. And then I took that sheet of glass and cut it into these shapes that made up the piece on the right. And so what I did was I think there was 8 to 1 inch. So there's 240 or so slices of glass, and then it was all fired together to full fuse. And then I polished it to high polish, so the thing is completely clear all the way around. So again, this is the ability of working with components. Next slide, please, Terry. And these fish here are another one of my side tracks into working with components. And I'm going to talk more about how to make them in a minute, but what I started doing was making these fish, and I could color them by hand. So as part of it was a lino cut block process, and part of it was coloring like in a monoprint, where I was adding layers of powder and enamels and micas and things to build up the coloration of the fish, and did that all independently of the background. So each time I added more powder, I could fire the single fish in the kiln. It's very, very fast. I could fire these twice a day. And the nice thing was, if the fish worked out, it could go into the piece. If it didn't, then I didn't have to use it, and I didn't compromise the piece by doing it all at once. Next slide, please. So I'll stop there and just, are there any questions before I get into the next part?
I'm going to do this so that I can see everybody and hear them as well. Sorry.
It's all intuitively obvious.
I'm going to stop sharing just for a moment so that I can see if anybody's got any questions. Do I see any hands up?
Anything in the chat line?
I don't see anything in the chat just at the moment. Did anybody have any questions that they wanted to ask? And of course, I've turned off all the cameras, so I can't see the chats. Hang on 1 minute. Now technical difficulties here. And start video. And I'll start these videos again.
There will be a test at the end of this.
And there we've got some videos coming back on. I hope this doesn't bump you out, Bob. But did anybody have any questions? Feel free to raise your hand if you would like. Either physically or using the, no, I'm not.
Okay, well, let's go back to the
to
slideshow then, please.
Okay, I will do that. Wait, let me just set something first. So I've got this going correctly. We'll do it to the speaker and then we'll do the view. There we go. And we'll be back into this slideshow right here. And make it go. There we go. Oh, I've got everybody on the side here. Hang on 1 minute. I have found out, Bob, with your background the way it is, with the black background, I can't quite see. Maybe let me stop sharing.
Well, this looks okay to me.
I want to resume share. It looks okay. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
We'll carry on like that then.
Yeah.
Okay.
So with that sort of the technical stuff behind, it's also about place. And I worked in Calgary for almost 30 years, and then we moved to Salt Spring. And the move to Salt Spring was just a real blessing. And it's had a huge impact on my art, how I think about art, how I interact with other artists. And this is our property here. And the building off to the left is my studio. And I have the shortest commute that I've ever had in my life. It's only 3 or 4 steps. And I work in the studio every day. And Salt Spring is just an amazingly creative community. There are painters, photographers, sculptors, fabric artists, and I belong to something called Art Night, where we get together in pre-COVID times. We get together once a month and have a potluck supper, and then bring out new artwork. And maybe 25 people show up in an evening and 6 new pieces of art. And I have learned so much from these other artists. And I'm the only glass artist that goes there. It's the painters, they're talking about the quality of the line, the photographers talking about composition. So I've really picked up an awful lot from them. And so one of the impacts was that I had to shut my studio down for a year between the time we moved from Calgary to here, and had to renovate the building to make it into the studio. So for a year, I didn't do any glass. And when that year was over, I had a brand new studio, state of the art. I just loved it. And I remember walking in, and I had this, I now call it my crisis of confidence, because I looked at this brand new setup, everything you could ever want. And I had 2 questions. Number one was, could I still do it? Because I hadn't done it for a year. But the bigger question was, do I still want to do it? And, that was a real challenge. So next slide, please. So my solution to this was to do what I now call my self-imposed residency. And I took 2 months and I said to myself, I will work on new work. I will push my limits. And when I say work, it was every day in the studio doing tests and doing all sorts of samples and having failure and learning and moving on and more tests. So my first one was taking that crackle technique that you saw in those earlier bowls and seeing how I could change them and taking it from that very organic shape to these much more controlled pebbles. And I really like them. They float in the glass, and they've got this fine line around each one to help define their shape. So that was one of the things I did. The next slide, please. I thought, well, how could I, instead of having that organic texture, how could I start getting linear patterns in powders? And so I started playing with different ways of working with the powder, and I use water in this. And by getting different amounts of water in the powder, I could cut it very easily with a blade. So I could start getting this more organic shape. And next slide, please. And then a little bit of the obsessive compulsive came out in me, and I wanted to take that very irregular pattern and get really precise lines in it. And so my first 3-month residency, 2 or 3 month residency resulted in these 3 different styles. And I came out of that just invigorated. It was just my energy and my joy was back. And so every year now I take 2 to 3 months to work on something new. And it's not like I go in on the 1st of January and say, what am I going to do? I actually start thinking about it in November. And I think about a problem that I have, or something about design, or something that I really want to address. And I start thinking about it. And then when generally I do this in January and February and into March, then I go in and actually work at it and go through that whole logic process. So I'm going to show you some of the self-imposed residencies that I've had other than this one here. Next slide, please. So one of them was getting designs around the edges of pieces. And I talked about this one earlier, but before, all my designs had been right and cover the whole piece. And now I just wanted to focus on the design on certain parts of the bowl. So I had to learn how to isolate the powders. Next slide, please. And then I got really intrigued with deep shapes. And I thought that the textures that I worked with would look really good if I could elongate them and stretch them out during firing or during slumping. And so I started making all these goblet shapes, which they're called dropouts or aperture slumps. And you essentially just heat a blank of glass and let it slowly move down through a hole in a piece of refractory material. And it was really tricky to learn how to do this. And it really worked out well. These pieces started out an inch thick. And by the time they get slumped down this far, they're down to about 1/4 of an inch thick. So takes 5 hours once they reach 1150 degrees. So it's a very slow process. I'm in there the whole time, watching it and controlling the heat. Next slide, please. And one of the other aspects of working with deep shapes is getting these, they're called step molds, where you slump in one shape, and then you take that shape and you put it into a different mold, and you take the piece that comes out of that, which is a little bit deeper, and you put it in a third mold and slump it again. So you end up with these very tight vessels that you couldn't get normally in one slump. And I make them, and then I started playing with different ways of modifying the design in them. So the glass here, I used yellow glass instead of my normal clear glass, and I put all these wafers, different colors around the edge, and built the white and blue pattern right up to the very edge. And then after it was slumped, I went in with essentially a high-powered Dremel tool and carved away all that which I didn't want. And then I did some sandblasting. So I spent as much time cold working this and modifying the shape as I did in actually making it, making the design. And you know, I quite like it. It's a real challenge, and I've worked quite a bit with them. Next slide, please. And this is just a close-up. And again, this is why I really like working with powders. You know, you get all these subtle colors, and depending on how I ground the colors away, I got these really lovely patterns. So it was a really fun piece. My heart was in my throat when I was doing the grinding, but if you're not taking risks, you know, you're not moving forward. Next slide, please. And I've continued this. I still really like working with these deep shapes, and so I've been working the last 2 or 3 years with a continuing series of working with lines and seeing how they translate when they're slumped. But I've got pretty good at this, so now I can take the same setup of bowls and slump them and repeatedly get the same shape out of them with hardly any variation, and they actually balance. There's I don't do any grinding on the bottom, or very little grinding on the bottom, and they balance on their own. Next slide, please. So another one of my self-imposed residencies was looking at printmaking, and printmaking has been very popular in kiln form glass. And I thought I'd do a little bit of a different take, because a lot of the printmaking that's done conventionally is done with enamels and silk screens. And I thought, well, I'd like to do it all with glass powder. And so I studied some books on printmaking, and I decided to try making my own lino cut blocks. And so on the upper left is one of my little lino cut features. And I have this thing about fish, and they all show up at the beginning of a series for me. And so what I did was I carved the pattern into the lino cut block, and then sifted powder onto a kiln shelf, and then pressed that on the lino block onto the powder. And what happened was the powder got pushed up into all my carved out areas. And then if I fired it to a really low temperature where the powders just sinter together, I can go in with a Dremel tool and carve away all the excess powder. And so then that's my base, and then I can color it. And those tiles in the bottom left-hand corner are different ways of coloring it. So I can use transparent powders, I can use enamels, I can use micas, I can use sgraffito techniques, I can use all sorts of combinations. And so each one is a mono print, because I hand color them. And the result are these seahorse shapes. And then when I like them, I can fire them onto a bowl. So that was a fun residency, and getting quite out of my comfort zone. Next slide, please. And working with artists here on the island, they're always talking about the quality of the line, and I realized that we don't pay enough attention to lines in kiln form glass. And the line will direct your eye around a composition. It'll help separate color fields. It's really an important design element. But most of the time in kiln form glass, it's really hard to draw a line at 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. And so we don't see as much line work in there in kiln form glass as what I would like. So I started working with ways of getting lines into glass. And this was the first go at it. Next slide, please. And then I sort of got influenced by Pete Mondrian and started working with very, very precise placement of lines. And the colored lines in there are glass stringers, and they're only 1 millimeter wide, but on either side, there's a very, very fine black powder, which really helps to highlight those shapes. Next slide, please. And I've continued on with those lines. And what I really like working with these lines is they start off as straight lines, but during the slumping process, they get distorted and changed. So I really, you know, they're constantly evolving. Next slide, please. And one of the versatilities of working with lines is you can obviously get all different colors. And so here's, instead of using those combinations with the reactions, I'm using colored stringers. And you know, once you get used to the final shape, you can actually see how those patterns are going to change as the bowl distorts during slumping. Next slide, please. And I have a what if kind of mind. So I thought, well, if you can get straight lines, how can you get curved lines? And so what these are is, these are curved shapes, and I can consistently make the exact curve I want by pressing the powder up against a French curve. But the trick is I mix the powder with a compound called modeling glass, and it turns it into essentially a pheno clay. And so I've got, instead of having hard, sharp glass, I've got this clay to work with. And I really like this because if you look in detail, all these patterns branch and they mold together. So you can get quite a precise and controlled shapes. Next slide, please. And so that led to, well, what about working with shapes instead of lines? And so this is one of my pieces in the Sooke show this year. And it was about how to get all these different sizes of circles and patterns, and thinking more about design work with the glass. And this is just my toe in the water here, so it's I'm quite excited about this. Next slide, please. And a lot of my work is about home, and Lisbeth and I have coffee every morning. I'm her barista boy, and it's our way of starting the day. We talk about, you know, what we're going to be doing, and generally by the time the caffeine hits, I'm ready to hit the studio. And so I made this piece, and it's just a coffee cup that, you know, it's like me suddenly getting up from the table and the coffee cup's rattling around. And so it's to really commemorate what to me is a very special time in the day. Next slide, please. And Lisbeth and I are avid readers. And Lisbeth has worked in the publishing industry for 20 years. And so books are really common and important in around her house. And I love the look of a room when you walk in and you see a stack of books. It's a casual thing. It shows that the room is lived in. And so I've done quite a few of these books. And what I do is, before I assemble them together in groups of 3, I put them out like the books on a library table at the closing of the library day, before the shelvers come back and put everything back where they belong. Next slide, please. And we're both avid gardeners, so I made these groups of bowls and glued them together to represent different styles of flowers, and these all hang on the outside of the house, so you can see them from the road. Next slide, please. And a lot of my work came because of my influence in geology, or being influenced by geology, goes right back to the earth. So I made a series of sculptures about mountains, and the idea was to take the essence of a mountain and reduce it down to a few shapes and lines and intersections. And so this was one piece that I did. Next slide, please. And this was another one. And these were quite challenging to make, but I really enjoyed them. And again, it was trying to look at a mountain and taking it apart down to a few lines and curves. Next slide, please. And this piece, believe it or not, is about the ocean floor. And if you look at the National Geographic map of the North Atlantic, there's something called the Mid-Oceanic Ridge. And it's this pattern of magnetic striping that represents how the continents have moved apart. And I've always thought that was just a really elegant pattern. And so I made this triptych up, and each panel is about 20 inches tall and 12 or 13 inches wide. And it took me a month to make these. Next one, slide, please. And this piece here is called The Puzzle, and it kind of represents what geology is. It's you have little bits of information and you have voids in between. And so and it's all pattern recognition. So you have to put them together and build a story with connecting the lines. So these pieces are all made independently. And if a geologist was sitting and look at this, they could come up with some sort of a history of what happened with the landform here. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, I make some of these small sculptures that have waveforms in them and then have elements on top. So it's, you know, the flotsam and the jetsam of things that are washed up on the shore. And again, they have a lot of patterning in the sands. Next slide, please. And sometimes I get a little bit whimsical. And I affectionately call this series When Stephen King Meets Lloyd Bridges. And if you remember Sea Hunt, Lloyd Bridges was always getting his foot stuck in giant clams. So I started thinking about making these, and these are just bowls that I've taken the one edge of the bowl and ground it down and glued them together to make these seashells. And I put all these different feeding mechanisms in them, and they're pretty macabre. So it's, I think I spend too much time alone in the studios. Next slide, please. And this was a piece that I did jointly with Lisbeth, and she's a quilter. And so this wall piece, she did the quilted background, and I made all these fish, and their fish are mounted on sheets of glass and then slumped so you get that waveform as they're swimming through the water. And you know, it was a fun project, and both the glass and the quilting carried equal weight in it. Next slide, please. And I do a few conceptual pieces, and I was invited to go into a show here on the island called Homage. And I took the idea of Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, where she invited, I think it was 39 women through history that had made major impacts. And I've always loved that piece. And I decided to do the brunch. And I'd invite 4 people that had a huge impact on my art career. So each place setting was made in their style. And when I researched, I actually tried to think the way they would do it and build the way they would do it. And in researching the artists, you really learned that it would have been a very interesting conversation over brunch. Next slide, please. So this is the view from the top, and it's Pete Mondrian at 3 o'clock, William Morris at 6 o'clock, Lauren Harris at 9 o'clock, and Andy Goldsworthy at 12 o'clock. And I'll show you each one of them. Oh, and if you look at the cutlery, I made handles for each one of the pieces. I bought spoons and cut off the ends and made handles that would be appropriate. And the glasses were done as roll-ups, and even the place setting, the floral setting in the middle was done with lamp working and making spirals and twists and things. Next slide, please. So this was Andy Goldsworthy's, the Scottish environmental artist. And when I did this one, you know, he's big on the environment. So most of this was done with scrap glass so that it wasn't using new material. Next slide, please. And this was Lauren Harris. And the image in the top corner there is Mount Lefroy. And I used that as the model to design this piece. So the placemat and the bowl really go well together. Next slide, please. And this is Pete Mondrian's. So you saw the bowl earlier, and now the placemat that went with it. And the last one, please. And this is William Morris's piece. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, he had a huge influence on me on texture, on coloration, on imagery, on components. And so I tried to do a sort of another way that Morris could have done a place setting. Next slide, please. And we have the SNAP exhibition every 2 years here on the island. This was my entry for 1 year, and it was a cityscape. And I just made these blocks. They're up to some of the taller blocks are almost a foot tall, and they're 1 inch to 1.25 inches thick. And when I started making them, I had one vision, but I realized that they looked like office buildings. And so I started playing with the idea of making a cityscape. And, you know, a city of the future, a lot of transparency. And next slide, you see that from an aerial view. And I even took it outside so I get the sunlight on it and get this really very realistic cityscape view. Next slide, please. And this is probably the only political piece I've ever done. And it's called We All Hang by a Thread. And I did it in response to the American election in 2016. And I was so frustrated with how truth was being manipulated and shattered, really. And I started thinking how everything was little white lies, and you know, truths were being torn up. And so I wanted something that was transparent. To me, you know, truth should be transparent. And I made this piece, as I said earlier, by fusing a whole bunch of single sheets of glass together. And then I had to cold work the whole thing and polish it. So it took me a week just to polish it, but I wanted it so that you could see through it. And it's shaped like an airfoil. So the idea is that it spins in the wind. So whatever way the wind's blowing, that's where truth lines up. And to present it, I have it hanging from a thread, from a steel cable. And so it, you know, has that very precarious look. And you know, when you move by it, it moves. Just the air currents move. So again, this was my catharsis for the whole farce of the 2016 election. Next slide, please. And it's about circumstances. And the piece on the far right is my other selection in the or piece that was selected for the Sooke Fine Arts Show. And I started making these shapes, and I realized that they looked like robes. And so I started playing with the concept of making sort of a garment. And I joked that, you know, when I was a kid, my mother always said, go out and make new friends. Well, during COVID, without the ability to socially interact with people, I decided to literally make new friends. So I started making all these different characters that represented different aspects of society. So the one on the left is sort of the chieftain with the, you know, the banner. The one in the middle represents prehistoric man and hunting, and his robe has got you know, buffaloes and horses on it. And the one on the right has beads, and it's the artisan. It's the person that's selling their work. So this was my catharsis for being stuck in the studio and not being able to socialize with my friends. Next slide, please. And these were some other ones that I made sort of in the same vein that were looked at more design and patterns, but also kind of represented power and authority. Next slide, please. And for me, it's about education. And I made a conscious decision midway through my glass career to focus on education, because I love being with creative people. It's a real joy. And I started teaching, and I've done a lot of teaching internationally and nationally. And I just find it's a real charge to be in a workshop with people. And that led to doing these ebooks along the top. And I write articles for Glass Art Magazine. And now that we can't travel for teaching, I've been doing some online teaching through a studio in the UK. And this has actually allowed me to get and teach with other artists at the same time and co-teach classes. So it's been a real challenge and a joy. And I just love being with creative people. Next slide, please. And it's about trying. If you hit the slide again, please. So my very first day on the job, my boss said, if you're not trying, if you're not making mistakes, you're not trying hard enough. And that stuck with me all my life. And so I don't mind making mistakes. Mistakes are, another word for mistakes are experience. And if you're not making mistakes, you're just making the same thing time and time again. And I want to move forward. I think I actually surpassed his expectations in the number of mistakes that I made during my career. But so next slide, please. And the Dalai Lama put it that remember that not getting what you want is sometimes a wonderful stroke of luck. And many of the things that I've done in glass have been accidents. And I've been able to recognize the potential of those accidents and actually turn it into a series. But to paraphrase the Dalai Lama, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards said, in the next slide, please. You can't always get what you want, but if you try, sometimes you find that you get what you need. So that really, a lot of people shy away from making mistakes. To me, it's part of the game. Next slide. And it has to be fun. If we're not having fun, then why are we doing it? And so I try all sorts of new things. And right now I'm into lamp working and making, one of these days, if I live long enough, I want to make glass goblets, Venetian goblets. But I have to learn by making beads and all these components that you build your skills up with. Next slide, please. And really, for me, it's all about the creative process. I love working with my hands. And if I'm not in the studio for a couple of days, I start getting antsy. So I enjoy it. It's just a total joy for me here living on Salt Spring and being able to do this in such a rich artistic community. I literally died and gone to heaven. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. And when I meet people at a show, they say, what's this work about? I've got all these different approaches that I can take with them. Mm-hmm. So any questions?
Just stop the share here and put everybody back in.
I'll turn my video on in the hopes that I won't.
All right, gallery view. Oh, I see Gertie has a question. So let me unmute people. I do also have a question here from Ray that says, what is the top temperature you take your wafers to?
It depends. It depends on the color of the glass, but I find a really good starting point is 1285 Fahrenheit or 696 Celsius. And I hold them there for about 10 minutes. So what it is about 30 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than a tack fuse. So if you have a small kiln, those firing chambers are usually quite hot. So cut back a little, like instead of 1285, go to 1275 or something.
Thank you. Gertie has a question.
Oh, I was just wondering about, Bob, you were saying you're doing online classes through a UK studio. And then I saw online that it said Leatherbarrow and Simmons. Are you teaching together with Amanda Simmons?
Yeah.
Well, that'd be wonderful. Along with you, Amanda was one of my favorite teachers I've taken classes from and found her very inspiring.
Well,
So,
it was interesting because I have loved Amanda's work
yeah.
for years, and so when we got stuck with COVID, I proposed to Warm Glass UK that this would be a good opportunity to have two people teach and teach a very specific topic, and we have different approaches to get to the same end. And
Yeah.
it is, I listen to what she has to say, and I think, I've never thought of it that way.
So if I wanted to take one of these classes, I go to Warm Glass UK to find the info?
Yep, and they post them on the beginning of every month.
Okay.
And we're doing it again in September.
Sounds great.
You got to get in there really quick, Gertie.
Okay.
I'm not that I'm trying to force you, but they sell out in 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay.
For any of the artists that are there. They have a tremendous teaching program there.
Yeah, Amanda was wonderful. I loved taking her class, and I can't imagine what you two would do together. But I just think it would be so fabulous.
Well, it's like a 3-ring circus, and we're up on a high rope, and there is no net underneath.
Yeah. Yeah. Looking forward to it. Hope I can get in.
Agreed. Anyone else have a question? Okay, Greta, go ahead. You'll need to unmute there.
There we go. When you the modeling medium, did you just add that to against sheet, or did you put it with other powders at all
Well,
for your background?
The modeling medium, it's if you look up Glassbird Studio.
I've used it. I've made stuff with it before.
Okay, so I just mix it up exactly by the instructions.
But your background, your dense white, was that a sheet, or did
Yeah,
you
that's a
put
sheet
powder over the modeling
Yeah.
medium? Very pretty lines, and I love those little people, your shaman looking things. Those are just fabulous. All your work is, but those are adorable.
Well, the trick with the modeling glass is to fire them upside down.
Okay, yeah.
Because if you fire them upside down, the weight of the sheet glass stops the surface tension from pulling the various pieces apart.
So put the modeling
No,
glass
sure.
down and the sheet on top.
Yeah, and firing it on fiber paper.
Put some little bits, but it didn't get nice as you got, and smaller pieces.
No, it's a great tool, and the white bowl with the blue circular patterns, that circular pattern, that's all modeling glass.
Okay, that's pretty.
I saw that Debbie had her hand up.
Oh, thanks, Terry. I loved seeing your work. Incredible. I'm not a glass artist, but I'm just curious, how toxic is the process for you as the artisan?
Sorry, I didn't catch the last part of that.
How toxic is your process for you?
It's the working with powders. I think they call it a nuisance. But I wear a full or half mask respirator that's a P95 respirator, and so all the time when I'm working in the studio, working with powder, I also am very meticulous with my cleanup after I've used powders. I don't brush them, I don't get them in the air, and I use a damp rag to clean up. I joke that I've been doing this, working with powders for 30 years, and I had a full head of hair when I started. And I don't know the frustration or the chemicals, but I'm very careful with it, and I believe with caution that it can be worked with safely.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So I see we're a little bit over time here, but I'm sure if there's anything else anybody would like to add, that's fine.
It was a great presentation. Thank you so much for doing this, Terry and Bob.
All right,
That
thank
was
you.
a lot of fun. As I said, I love being with creative people. And so it's just a joy.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I have to say, I'm really intrigued by your idea to take sabbaticals and just take some time to really work on a specific question that you have in mind, and taking that time to allow yourself to work through a process and doing it with some rigor every year. I admire that sort of thinking, yeah, and that ability to take that time for yourself to do that. So
it's a nice luxury to have. You know, I don't have to make a living from glass. So I have that luxury that I can take the risk of taking 3 months and having total failure and not losing income. So I appreciate that people that are making a living from glass, it's a very hard thing to do. But if you're fortunate enough, every year I've done it, every year something's come out of it.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Bob, for this presentation. As I mentioned, it is being recorded. We'll be able to put it up online to others that you might want to share, that you know are in glass work and would like to learn a little bit more. I learned a whole lot more about stuff that I have no idea about, glass powders and stuff. I find it really interesting. I will let you know that we have another couple of talks coming up. Tomorrow night is Susan Perney Mark talking about her piece Along the Fraser, which is part of a fabric art series. And actually you can see the piece on in person at the Sooke Arts Council Gallery right now. It was one of the award-winning pieces and it's up there. And then on Wednesday, we've got Craig Harris talking about turning photographic caterpillars into butterflies and his process to take original photos and the transition that they go through using digital products to find some artistic merit at the end. And then on Thursday, we actually have two talks. We've got one going on in the afternoon in the place of our usual seniors tea event, which is Delia McRae talking about what makes a great photograph and showing some of her amazing works that she's done a lot of travel. So she's got some great photos lined up there. And then in the evening, a really practical one, and it's by Shannon Lee Ray, who is the head of our design team. She's our design team lead, and she's talking about living with your new art and how to actually place it on walls. And she did this talk last year. It was really useful. I learned all sorts of things that I was doing wrong, but also Shannon's very engaging speaker, so it's fun to listen to her. She's great at question and answer, and again, an opportunity to learn a lot about some things you may not know so much about. So anyways, I would like to thank you all for being here, and maybe we'll see you next time, hopefully in person somewhere along the way. And I hope you get a chance to come up and see the award winners show, and that you've had a chance to really search through the online show as well. So I'll say good night and take care, everybody, and we'll see you soon. All right.
Thank you both.
Bye-bye.
Well, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.